How many poems do we have to write? How many poems do we have to write about sexism before we stop calling females sluts, whores, and hoes for doing what heterosexual men really want them to do? But what do they want from them? Sex. To spread their legs and occupy a space that was never theirs and will never be theirs. I respect myself, so I'll close my legs, but that's what it means for me. So don't act like females who have sex don't respect themselves, because it looks different for every female. Because when it comes to sexism, women can be just as bad as men. Because most females do respect themselves, and they know how to respect themselves and still be themselves. Because women are good for more than just their bodies, because women don't need to stay barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, because women aren't sexual objects to be had, because women don't need your permission to work in the workplace, because women can do more than just take care of children. So how many poems do we have to write about sexism before something changes? How many poems do we have to write about rape culture and consent before everyone starts believing that rape can happen in a man or woman, girl or boy, before we start believing that sexual harassment happens to both gender because sexual harassment knows no gender, before we start believing that no means no and anyone can change their minds at any point, because we've got people, mostly men but not just men, believing that a person's genitals and body is their right, because we've got people, mostly men but not just men, believing that they decide when no means no. Because I'm tired of hearing about rape culture and people needing to ask for consent without anything changing. We write these poems to educate and no one listens and takes action. You hear us and you let it go through one ear and out through the other without taking action. So how many poems do we have to write about rape culture and consent before we do something? How many poems do we have to write about young people dying in America by gunfire? In a war that we never approved of. We've got people dying in Chicago and cities around the world, but we're still talking about that gorilla that got shot dead because a mother refused to watch her child. So how many poems do we have to write about young people dying in America by gunfire before we decide to change the regulations on buying guns? Because I'm not talking about taking away people's guns. I'm talking about making sure certain people are never able to buy guns. And I'm talking about making sure certain people never have a gun in their possession. So aren't you tired of hearing poems about young people dying in America by gunfire? Well, if you want it to stop, you have to make sure the killings by gunfire stop. So how many poems, speeches, and talks about guns are you going to listen to before you do something? So are you tired of hearing about gun violence in America? I am, and we should do something. So how many poems do we have to write about people dying in America by gunfire before we take action? How many poems do we have to write about the LGBTQ plus before we all realize that it's none of our business the other choices that others make for their lives? Tell me, why does it matter to you what they do? We've got some extreme Christians deciding to be judge, jury, and executioner, when that's God's job, because Jesus said, "He that is without sin among you, let him be the first to cast a stone." But some believe they're so righteous, but for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So I don't understand why we think that someone else's life is our right, because God said there's no one righteous, not even one. Let's remember one thing: our Savior hung out with the godless, broken, and sinful people. He witnessed to the sinful and he never berated them for their sins. It's our job to witness and share our testimony. It's not our job to criticize and judge. We share our testimonies in God. He does the real work. So why is it our job to criticize choices people make in their lives when their choices aren't killing people or sending them to jail or destroying their lives? Oh, wait, it's not. It's not our job. It's our job to love your neighbor as yourself. So how many poems do we have to write about the LGBTQ plus before people start to realize it's none of their business? How many poems do we have to write about feminism rights? We need to stop letting these old white men decide the fates of women, because it's our job to push equality for both sexes in and out of the workplace. It's not our job to judge people for their choices they make with their bodies. It's not our job to say you can't do that when it comes to someone else's body. The bodies of women are not the political playground of the patriarchy. So why do we still have men getting paid more than women for the same exact job? Why Are women supposed to aspire to marriage as if that's the only goal for living? Why is it so wrong for equality of both sexes, politically, socially, and economically? How many times do we need to hear about feminism before we decide to change? Before we decide female politicians' outfit isn't as important as their policies. And before we decide a female's dating life and outfit choices shouldn't matter as much as their career. So how many poems do we have to write about feminism rights before we start acting? How many poems do we have to write about racism before we start caring? Before white Americans, or at least more of them, start realizing that it still exists. Before we stop saying that just because someone hangs with black people, that's proof that they're not racist. Before more white Americans start becoming allies instead of opponents to progress, before we stop asking for assimilation and allow people to represent their ancestry, before we stop cultural appropriation and instead actually learn about the history, before minority people, children, and adults stop dying in the streets, before people stop calling dead minority people thugs who deserve to die. Before it stops mattering if they were an ex-convict, before we make the decision of whether or not to care about their death. Before we realize it's not okay to ask to search a minority person's car without probable cause. Before we realize that it's not okay for a minority person to go to jail more often, even though all races commit the same crimes at the same rate. Before we realize that a minority person with 5 grams of crack cocaine and a Caucasian person with 500 grams of powder cocaine both going to jail at the same time is wrong. Before we start to look at the history and see that Reagan made the rule and that maybe he wasn't so great, before we realize that the person with more cocaine should go to jail for more time, it's just basic math. Before we realize that our jails are the new Jim Crow and the justice system isn't working. So how many poems do we have to write about racism before we admit it exists and make a plan to stop it? How many poems do we have to write about social, political, and economic injustice before we decide to care and make a plan to change it? I'm tired of trying to educate people who don't listen. I'm tired of people who complain but refuse to do something. I'm tired of people not admitting the truth and refusing to see what's right in front of them. I'm tired of the hypocrisy this nation stands on. I'm tired of being denied change that is well-deserved. I'm tired of people caring more about animals' lives than the lives lost to gang wars, gun violence, racism, or war. Things are upside down in this country, and we need to fix it. So when will we fix it? So how many more poems do we have to write about social, political, and economic injustice before we decide to do things differently this time?